And there we go, recording in progress. So just to get going, for those of you that don't know me, I am Michelle. Performance High is my business, endurance coaching and swim lessons, swim coaching. Thank you everybody for coming in. We have a really big group tonight, which I'm super excited about. I told Antonio, I said, I gotta have Antonio every month because he brings in the folks. So this is great. I'm super happy. So thanks for registering and coming in. And I will let Antonio do his own introduction. So take it away, sir.
Sweet. Thanks, Michelle. My name is Antonio Gonzalez, and I am the owner of Tri-Town Bicycles in Hyde Park. I probably know a lot of the people on this call, but if not, I own a bike shop that started as a triathlon shop in 2011. My background that led me to that was pretty started really casual. When I was 14 years old, I I had a paper route that I did by bike, and it was a big route. But the end result was that I delivered newspapers every day for 8 years from like 4:30 a.m. until 6:30 a.m. And I just rode my bike a lot, and it would break down all the time. And little did I know it, but I was kind of learning some passive mechanical skills during that process and building like a pretty decent aerobic base. And most days I'd be probably running late, so I would end up, having to do effectively intervals to get it over with as fast as possible. But that was kind of how I got started with bikes. And when I was in my late teens, I started working in like professional bike shops and realized that I really liked it. And around that same time, I jumped in and did a triathlon, the Burley Spudman, and that was in 2004, I believe, maybe 2003. And I just got completely hooked. I loved the variety of the sport. It, I felt like I was kind of a natural at it. I placed relatively high. I think I was in the top 10 in my first try or something like that, maybe top 20. And but I also realized it was a sport where there was a lot I could learn. And I definitely at that time I wasn't like a particularly good student or like studious in any way, but I got so hooked on triathlon that I just wanted to learn everything I could about the sport. So that meant reaching out to Michelle to help be like a mentor and a coach to me. At that stage, I was probably like 20. And I started reading every book I could, which continued to be and is still to this day like a huge passion of mine, is just reading history or reading, the literature of people who were like really successful at their craft. And then of course sharing a lot of the knowledge.
Interject a quick thing. Antonio is the one person I get to talk books with, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Book talks all the time. So I love that you read.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think when you and I get together, I mean, most of the time we just talk about what we're reading, and sometimes it's sports related, not all the time. And heck, we even like started a book club together a few years ago. That was fun that we did that for a while. But yeah. So yeah, I loved, reading and sharing whatever knowledge I had with others. I ended up starting a triathlon club at Boise State, and I think that was probably 2004. And I became known at the bike shop I was working at as the triathlon guy. And that just led to a journey of me like becoming curious as I could about the sport, whether it be from a coaching perspective or a bike fit perspective. There were no there was a bike fitter or two in town at the time, and I had asked him after I did that first triathlon if he would help me install aero bars on my road bike. And I was like the 10 guys that beat me at the Burley Spudman, they all had aero bars and I didn't. I'm like you got to help me bolt these on and put me in a good position. And he told me that I don't need aero bars. He's like, there's no reason to use those. And that was when I realized I needed to go somewhere else. And ironically, by the way, little trivia, aero bars were invented in Sun Valley, Idaho, by the ski racers. They kind of observed, that when they want to go fast downhill, that they put their ski poles in front of them. And it's kind of how the original aero bars came about. And they were invented by Scott. Scott Bikes was located up there at the time. Anyways, that's a tangent. And so I ended up moving to the Midwest to work for a professional bike fitter out there, and eventually came back to Boise and worked in another local shop and kind of became known as a technician and working on as a guy who was really detail oriented when it came to maintaining bikes. And I think a lot of that came from the fact that when you work with triathletes, they have a very high standard for mechanical like perfection. Not that's probably not the right word, but like it needs to be done well, it needs to be done right because the consequences are high in two ways in my mind. One is like they're training almost every day. So if they're out of their bike for an extended period of time, they're like, shoot, I'm missing my key long ride. And then two, if you're tuning their bike up to go to a race, they probably have invested a lot of money and time into that. And if their like derailleur falls off or their chain breaks, it's a lot worse than just having your chain break on your casual like Saturday mountain bike ride. It's like, oh shoot, that just cost me thousands of dollars possibly. So you had to really design systems and kind of refine your craft to be very, very precise and have a high attention to detail and really test the service, the tunes you were doing. And so I just kind of became known as a guy that was doing that, I guess. And after a period of time, I, kind of was like, well, if I'm ever going to open a triathlon shop, I better do it. And in 2011, I partnered with another coach in town named Harold. And we opened Tri-Town as a tri-specific shop at the time. And yeah, and I think some of the people I see on here were some of our very first customers, which is really cool. And you had Erin Green on a month ago, right? She was actually our very first customer. She was waiting in line when we opened the doors, and she bought some cool stuff, like a tube or something like that at the time. But our shop was about 800 square feet, and which is a large bedroom, I think, or maybe something maybe a little bit bigger than that. And we just kind of focused on the triathletes, and we kind of tried to build a business that served them as best as possible. And then as we grew and expanded over the years, we took all the lessons we learned from servicing triathletes and tried to expand it to the broader market. So, like for example, well, like maybe an average shop in town may be back on service right now 2 or 3 weeks. Will be 2 or 3 days, and that's not because we rush. We actively try not to rush. It's because we built these systems in our service department to be really quick and so that we don't keep people out of their bikes for extended periods of time. Of course, we, really refined our bike fit system that we initially applied mostly just to triathletes, but now I do more fits on road bikes and gravel bikes and mountain bikes and triathlon bikes nowadays. And then, really just kind of kept it on that enthusiast market. Our mission statement states that, the inspired endurance athlete is our target market. And so that's really who we try to serve best, I think. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome, Antonio. You've really done a tremendous job of putting together a shop that works really well. So I'm always impressed with your systems.
Yeah.
You and Henry Ford should have you're like soulmates or something.
Yeah. That's where reading has been really great. And like one I feel like one lesson I've learned from reading is that like guys and gals in the bike industry, they probably didn't make a large enough fortune to really like justify writing a autobiography that people would read, but people in the auto industry did. And there's enough like it's a symbiotic enough industry that there's a lot of correlation. And I found some of the best bike industry lessons I learned from the auto industry. Like right now, I'm reading the autobiography of Les Schwab, of Les Schwab Tires. It is absolutely brilliant. He was a genius at developing incentive programs for his team and his staff so that each one of his locations was like highly motivated to be successful, which like we're a one store location. And one thing I've struggled with as we have grown is like, if we're going to open a second or third location, how do I replicate the passion that I feel? And I know we have I know a lot of people that are on this call know a lot of our staff. They're all amazing, but there is like when you own something, there's that extra level of like attention and concern. And like, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and be nervous that maybe I forgot to tighten a bolt or something. And I bet a lot of my staff feel that way, but I couldn't fully expect that. And like Les Schwab was like a genius in incentivizing his people to feel similar to the way he did, I'm not going to go into all the details about it because it's pretty amazing, but it's worth reading if you can find their books. They're totally out of print. But I mean, that's what resulted in his people like running out to your car when you pulled up with a flat tire, like they would run out of the store to greet you. I mean, that just doesn't exist in most industries. Henry Ford's similar. Another great one from the auto industry is the founder of Hyundai, Changju Yang, and his story is one of the most inspiring stories I've ever read. But yeah, yeah,
right.
and it was the history of Schwinn is really fascinating. Yeah,
My book list.
well.
We're book list.
Yeah, exactly. So,
yeah, go ahead.
oh yeah, well, I didn't want to ramble on about books because I could do that all day.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we can start with the questions that came in, unless anybody has any pressing questions right now. And please all don't be afraid to like just chime in. This is informal, so don't feel like you have to wait. So if you have questions, just bring them up. Let us know. Otherwise, yeah, we can just kind of start with the ones that we have already and see where that goes.
Cool. Yeah, what you sent me, Michelle, it seemed like the questions kind of hit a few different categories. The first one that kind of caught my mind was questions on maintenance, like bicycle maintenance. So I thought maybe I'd start with that. And then I saw some questions on technology, like cyclometers and things like that. That's a pretty interesting one we can knock through. Other questions came through on the pedal stroke and like maybe how the best cyclists in the world make an efficient pedal stroke and what to do if you feel an asymmetry in your pedal stroke. And then bike fit related discussion I thought could be cool too. I don't know if I'll have time for all of that in 1 hour, but we'll do our best, right? So cool. So with maintenance, one of the questions that came through was like, how often should you tune and service your bike? And probably the right answer to most questions is that it just depends. But I will tell you one thing I've noticed working with a lot of clients and other mechanics and training other mechanics is that the main thing I have to teach like new mechanics is they need to learn how to listen to their bike. And one theme, like the theme I talked about in my newsletter this morning, was how bike fitting is like relationship therapy. And in a way, just riding your bike is a little bit like being in a relationship with somebody. And if I hear my bike making a weird sound, it's like my wife, Amy, I can tell in the tone of her voice that she's not happy with me. And she doesn't have to tell me she's not happy with me. I can just hear it, right? Well, it's the same with my bicycle, right? Or with a bicycle. Once you get to know it, you'll get to know what sounds normal. And that's ultimately the state you're trying to keep it in, right? And so if I'm turning the pedals of a bike or riding a bike and I hear the chain squeaking, or if I hear something clunking around, if I hear a ticking sound, it's a subtle indication that something's wrong. And sometimes it's not so subtle, right? Sometimes it's quite dramatic, right? But most of the time it's subtle. And what happens with a lot of people is probably the same as what happens in a relationship that's kind of fallen apart. You just kind of hear it and you're just like, oh, whatever, they're just whining again. And that's when things start to go downhill. Then all of a sudden one day they come in and you're like, yeah, I've been whining at you for years. I want a divorce now. Well, that maybe is what happened with bikes when you ignore a sound long enough. So in a perfect world, your bike is perfectly quiet. You should not be able to hear anything. And so if you're riding your bike and you hear some clanking and grinding and things like that, what you're hearing is friction. And even mild friction can be quite audible, right? Like if we rub our hands together, right? Well, we don't really care if we rub our hands together, that generates some heat. But when you have friction on a bike, it generates resistance and I guess heat in that regards too. And resistance is going to slow you down and we want to go fast typically on our bikes. So the first thing is if you hear anything from your bike, it probably needs a little bit of attention. And that's honestly like one of the most overarching tips I can give somebody. Of course, there's sight as well when it comes to tuning and maintaining a bike. You can often look and just tell something's wrong. You may not be able to hear the fact that your bike is filthy, but you can probably see it. Ironically, just a dirty bike in and of itself isn't a problem. I would actually default to what it sounds like. If it's dirty but sounds good, it's probably okay. But keeping a bike clean never hurts anything. And there's different ways to go about doing that with different solvents. But I would say like just Dawn dishwashing soap and water is one of the safest, easiest ways to clean a bike, and probably cost per application is the cheapest it can ever be. So that doesn't, you will never hurt your bike by using like Dawn dishwashing soap. There are way better ones, but it's a start, right? Another thing to think about when it comes to maintenance is like the duration of time between service intervals. So when I ride my bike, I'm probably like lubing my chain every 100 to 200 miles, and I'm probably wiping it down like once every 2 or 3 weeks. And I'm probably like recharging the sealant in my tubeless tires every 6 months or so. Now, even if your bike is super quiet and looks really good, there are certain things that you'll just need to take care of on a certain interval of time. And like the sealant in tires is one of those, for example. Another one may be just the cables on the bike. They'll just start to over time corrode and stretch out and need to be replaced. So it's a little, that's another, I guess, little tip there. Yeah. So anything come to mind, Michelle, in that regards?
I was just gonna say I have the you're gonna laugh at my little thing. I always joke it when my bike sounds like the cheap Kmart tricycle, then it's time to
Yeah.
go get it taken care of.
Yeah. Well, you're probably not wrong, and yeah,
But the
it's
sound
one of the most,
for me.
yeah, yeah. It's a really beautiful thing when a bike does not make a single sound and you can just ride it and all you hear is maybe some wind noise. That's what you were going for. And that's usually a very efficient machine. A cool piece of trivia is that a human rider on a bike is the most efficient animal like in the universe. And a person just walking or running, without their bicycle is like way down the list of animal efficiency, right? But the moment you put us on a bike, like nothing can touch us from like miles, like calories per mile from standpoint. And anyways, I just think a bike is so cool, and that's why I think it'll just survive the test of time and will continue to survive the test of time like it has.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I agree.
yeah.
So on that note, Antonio, are there things that you recommend doing like before you go on any ride and then after you're done with any ride? Or is it simply a sight and sound thing?
Yeah, yeah, there's definitely so at the shop we have this one of our little systems or policies is we call them a safety check, and it literally takes 10 seconds to do. And what we tell our mechanics is this guarantees somebody that if they jump on this bike, they're not going to die from a mechanical mistake on the bike, right? And what we do is we kind of like stand in front of the bike, we hold the tire up between our thighs and we like rotate the handlebars side to side. We push down on them. And that's checking the cockpit to make sure there's no bolts loose there, which if a bolt is loose, the whole handlebars could drop and you could, face plant maybe into the pavement. We then squeeze the brakes and they should engage. And the correct, like a brake that engages to specification should contact the rim or the disc rotor at 50% through its stroke. So if you squeeze the brakes, they should be contacting halfway through their stroke. So we squeeze them and of course they should bite, they should engage. We then push on the tire and then wiggle it side to side. We push on the tire to make sure there's air in it. You should have air, right? And then we wiggle it side to side to make sure that the axle or the quick release isn't loose. There should be no lateral movement of the wheel as you kind of grab it and shake it side to side. We then move to the side of the bike and we grab the seat and we rotate it side to side and push down on it. There should be no movement or no knocking or any sounds coming from that. We then go to the back wheel, we push on the tire, and then we jiggle the wheel side to side. And that's checking the rear hub to make sure it's tight in the frame and all that. So that whole process, just grabbing the front, twisting, grabbing the tire, twisting, pushing, saddle, twisting, pushing, rear tire, pushing, and twisting, that takes like 10 seconds. And it will at least make sure that something's not going to fall off your bike and like cause you serious harm. It doesn't guarantee that the tire is the perfect pressure or that the bike's going to shift great, but it mostly takes care of the stuff that could kill you. And I do that every single ride, and especially if I'm ever jumping on somebody else's bike, because another saying we have at the shop is never trust the mechanic that came before you, and never trust the rider that came before you. And so, we like to think that everything's in good working order, but that's just asking for trouble. And so I do a safety check every time I jump on a bike, even my own commuter bike. I check the tire pressure just because it's so simple to keep it aired up. And other than that, other than a safety check, that's about it. If I have an electric shifting bike, I'll check the battery from time to time, but those are pretty low maintenance too. And yeah, a bike that's well made and well maintained in the sense that you've just done the basics, it should be incredibly low maintenance. And there'll be maintenance, especially if you're riding a lot. And if you ride in really bad weather, that could really, require a lot more. But it's not a lot really. Now, with that said, I am a mechanic, so I often know exactly what I need to address. I once told my wife, Amy, that I think I was talking to her about a client or an athlete that was having all these mechanicals and bike races. I was like, I don't get it. Like I've done like hundreds of races and I've never had a mechanical. And she looks at me and she's like, dude, you have mechanicals all the time in bike races. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, I don't remember any of them. And she's like, well, you mention it casually, but you just take care of it on the spot. And so it doesn't cause me stress. But for somebody who doesn't have the luxury of that background, it can be really stressful. And that's honestly why we try really hard to be very precise in the work we do. And we don't get it right every time, but I think we get it right more than most. So, but yeah, that's about it.
So nothing on the back end, like you're done with a ride, nothing there.
Yeah. So the main thing I do after a bike ride has more to do. I mean, if it was a really wet or muddy day, then yeah, there's a fair amount of cleaning that takes place. But really, the only thing I do after a bike ride is lube the chain if it's time, right? And you won't go wrong if you lube your chain every 100 miles, plus or minus. But you want to lube a chain after a bike ride, never before. And the reason for that is, we live in Idaho, which is essentially a desert, at least where we live here. And it's a very dry environment, which means it's dusty. And you want to use a dry lube because once the liquid aspect of it, which is typically like a type of alcohol, has evaporated, it leaves behind like a wax, kind of a residue that's not particularly sticky to the touch. And that's what's really lubricating the chain. But if you put that on right before a bike ride and go ride, your tires are kicking up a lot of dust. And it's going to be sticking to that still wet chain. But if you just given it a couple hours, that alcohol would have evaporated and not collected any dust, and your chain would stay really clean. So I will lube my chain after a ride if it's been close to to 50 to 150 miles. I'll wipe off the excess if it's there. I'll use a dry lube, not a wet lube. If it's raining, I'll use a wet lube. Wet lube's like oil. It never really is not sticky. And so if we lived in Portland or Seattle where it's moist and there's very little dust around, those are totally fine lubricants to use. But we live in a very dry environment, a very dusty environment, right? But that's about it, really. Like, yeah, I'm kind of mostly just focused on getting food in me. I need more attention after a ride, more so than my bike.
Yes, the important stuff. Exactly. Oh, that's interesting about wet and dry lubes. I'm glad you pointed that out. That's helpful.
Yeah, we definitely like when somebody has a really greasy drivetrain and bike, like just covered in gunk, almost guaranteed just because of the lubricant they're using. And they're using a wet lube almost all the time. Now, the catch-22 with that is that a wet lube is actually a better lubricant. It lasts longer because it's like oil. It never really goes dry. But it collects so much dirt in this environment that it's just not worth it. Unless I was, a couple of years ago, I did the Lyle Pearson 200, and it was pouring rain at 5 a.m. when we started, and it was still pouring rain when we got to Sun Valley. And that was a day to use a wet lube, because we need that oil on the chain to keep it lubricated through all that rain and the pressure washing it's getting from the road, from the water coming off the tires. But on a beautiful day like today, yeah, dry lubes all the time, all the way.
Yeah. Good. Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Right.
We had a question about like tubed and tubeless tires, and I think that's one I hear a lot about in the shop. People asking about like the benefits or drawbacks of either of those, and that I think an important thing to know about that is that tubeless tires were first popularized for mountain bikes, and they've been accepted in the mountain bike side of things for probably close to maybe not 20 years, but close to it. And the tubeless technology, it really helps you at the lower pressures. It allows you to run lower pressures. It gives you, most importantly, more traction. And then secondarily, it lowers the rolling resistance of the tire itself. But for mountain biking, traction is huge. Like most of the things that prevent us from descending faster or climbing steeper hills on a mountain bike is traction, right? So the more traction we can get on a mountain bike, the better. Now, we've since seen tubeless technology be fully embraced by the road world. In my opinion, the benefits are, it's not even an opinion, it's just the truth. The benefits of road tubeless are less than they are for mountain tubeless, but they're still there. There's less rolling resistance. In general, you're less likely to get a flat, but they are more work. And in the sense that if you do get a flat, it's going to be a little messy if you're going to have to take that off. And also because it's still a relatively new technology, like mostly embraced in the last 10 years in the roadside, there's a lot of people that just don't fully understand it yet. And if you don't understand a technology or a mechanical machine or device, it can be a source of stress. And so I just recommend if you're going to run road tubeless and benefit from those marginal gains that it provides, that just be willing to embrace that technology and how it works. Like take it off sometimes and reinstall it and understand how that valve works. And you won't be so intimidated by it in the rare case that you do actually get a flat. But if somebody was really thinking of, so I guess like in my work, I'm deeply concerned about somebody's like I would call it like almost their emotional cost of ownership, which is like if they have something, if they're nervous about touching it or working on it, or they don't feel like they can, they're like, that's an emotional cost in my mind. And sometimes it can have a physical cost. Like if they're not willing to change their own flat with a tubeless tire, that's going to cost them 10 to 20 bucks every single time. When if they're willing to like really dive into it and figure it out, they could do it for just the cost of an inner tube or the cost of a blast of air from a pump or an air compressor, right? And so if somebody's like, hey, I want the most reliable, most simple, setup possible, I'd probably still run them on inner tubes, and I would just add sealant to the inner tubes. The sealant is what makes the tubeless tires relatively flat resistant. It's not really the tire itself. And the sealants used is a lot like our blood. It coagulates when you get a hole in your skin. The blood fills that hole and coagulates. Little platelets pack it up, and you don't bleed out, right? In theory, but of course, if you really chop your arm, the the blood's not going to fix that. You're going to have to go in for a deeper surgery, right? And the sealants are almost exactly the same. Relatively small holes, nail holes, staples, goat heads, things like that. It's going to seal that. Occasionally, pieces of glass that may gash the tire. But if it's bigger than that, you're going to have to put a spare tube in or a boot or something like that. And so anyone that's going to use like tubeless technology, they really should just make an effort to understand it. And like our shop, we put on throughout the season tire flat clinics that are like 10 bucks, the cost that we charge to change a flat. And it's like an hour-long class, and you get guys and gals with a lot of experience teaching you how to do this and getting you comfortable, getting a little dirty, working with your hands and figuring it out.
Nice. Can you mentioned a couple times that the tubeless technology on road bikes is minorly beneficial? Can you quantify that in any way? Like what's
there's some really good websites out there that will actually show you like the savings in watts from like a inner tube tire to like a non-inner tube tire of the same quality. And I think like the difference of running like a latex inner tube with a really high quality tire to going to a tubeless tire, no inner tube at all, but the same high quality tire, just set up tubeless, is something like a watt of power, maybe less.
Yeah.
Now that's assuming you're running apples to apples in tire quality. Now, what a lot of athletes would do, especially triathletes, because they are nervous about getting a flat, right? We don't have like the road racers have like a car following right behind us, that's going to change our flat for us if something goes wrong. We have to be able to fix that at least in a reasonable amount of time, or we're going to wait for 2 hours for the van to come by and help us out. So they're nervous, about getting that flat. And so they'll often run like a thorn resistant tire and maybe even a thicker tube, maybe a tire liner, and then a bunch of sealant. And that's like rolling around with an Abrams tank on your tire, on your wheel, right? That's a lot of extra resistance. And I think when I've seen the articles and the documents that talk about that extra like resistance in watts, it's something in the order of like 20 some odd watts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, like when
That's,
somebody runs a gator skin hard shell, which is a real durable tire, like you can get like 4 to 5 thousand miles of riding out of it. I mean, if you hold 120 watts for an Ironman, you're probably giving up 15 to 25 of those by running those tires,
mhm.
and it's substantial. The simplest thing an athlete can do to gain some free speed is to run a really high quality tubeless tire or inner tube tire with just a high quality inner tube tire with like a latex tube or a nice high quality butyl tube.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Nice. Nice. Super helpful. Good.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it. Again, just a reminder, guys, if you have questions, please jump in. Don't feel like you can't. So we want to make
Sweet.
sure that your issues are addressed. So.
Yeah. Another question that I saw right in earlier was the wear of a bicycle on a trainer versus outdoor. And I thought that was a really good question that we also get a fair bit in the shop.
What did you guys do?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I may just be getting some background information or some
Yeah.
background noise.
Sorry.
Yeah,
No, he
cool.
wasn't talking.
No, it's all good. It's all good. So yeah, with a trainer versus outdoor riding. So the main thing happening on a trainer is you tend to shift a lot less. And so you end up staying in one, maybe two or three gears a lot more than when you're outdoors, where you just have typically a lot more variety of terrain. The problem with this is you just wear out those few gears quite quickly. Also, people may ride for a very, very long time without ever lubing their chain, right? They just kind of jump on it and go. And then another thing I see is that we have this lack of wind resistance. And so we end up sweating a lot more onto the bike. Well, typically the wind is, moving that sweat behind us and it's evaporating off our back. But instead on our trainer, it's dripping right down onto the front of the bike and rusting out the cockpit components. So the stem, the handlebars, the aero bars, things like that. So that's the main wear and tear difference. But the similarities are that you're still wearing out the chain, you're still wearing out the bottom bracket, you're still wearing out the chain rings on the front to a similar degree indoors or out, but you may just be on the indoor trainer wearing out a couple gears a lot more quickly than others. And unfortunately for most cassettes, you can't just replace a single cog or two in the back gear cluster. You have to do the whole thing. So yeah. And that's about it. One great tip that almost anyone can really extend the life of their equipment on their bike is when they're not riding their bike, shift the bike to the small ring in the front and the small ring in the back. And what that does is that detensions the springs in your derailleurs and it detensions the cables and the shifters themselves if you have cabled, mechanical shifters on your bike. What I tell clients is when you're at rest, let your bike rest. And that is how you do it. You go to the small ring in the front and the small little cog in the back. So it's technically cross-chained. You wouldn't normally ride this way, but it takes the tension off everything to at least as much as it can be detensioned. And you will literally extend the spring life of your components probably indefinitely, while if you left them, like a lot of times, my house is a little bit on a hill. And so at the end of every bike ride, I'm in my climbing gear in the back. Well, I actually do like a circle or two around my driveway to shift back down into the hard gear in the back, which is the little cog, so that I can detension the derailleur in my rear bike's rear derailleur, right? So it can rest when I'm at rest, and that will, in theory, the derailleur springs and the cables will last like years longer by just simply doing that single thing. We see bikes often need full derailleurs replaced, often cables, and sometimes even shifters replaced because they put their bike up on the ceiling at the end of the winter. It was in the big ring in the front. it was in a climbing gear in the back, and then they put it on the ceiling for like a year or something like that. Well, that's like taking a slinky, like if we take that as a spring and extending it for a year, it's not going to really retake its original shape. And that slinky is not going to be as springy, I guess. Right. So you just let those springs relax, and you can just do that by cross chaining small to small.
Interesting. I've never heard
Yeah.
that. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah.
So with that, does that apply to, I know we're not talking about mountain bikes, but does that apply to mountain bikes that have single speed in the
Yeah.
front? Or
Yeah,
single speed in
absolutely.
the front? Okay. All right.
Yeah. We have in electric bikes or electric shifting bikes or not, just shift it to the hard gear in the back, the smallest cog that you have. And it just detensions as many things as possible. Yeah.
That is good to know. Good, good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yay. All right.
Another question I saw come through, Michelle, was something regarding technology. It seemed like we had somebody who was kind of new to riding, and they were talking about like what cyclometer they should buy. And I'm not going to probably say exactly what cyclometer somebody should buy. I mean, if they drilled me for it, I will. But more from a philosophical question, which I love that, is I believe somebody should not buy more technology than what they're willing to embrace. And so I see a lot of new athletes buy power meters, maybe heart rate monitors, GPS with mapping features and all of that. But then they end up not really using it. It just ends up being like this little mini supercomputer on their bike that they don't really know how it works or what any of that information means. And I'm a big believer of like learning a technology in a similar way that the technology was developed. And so if we just bring this back down to basics, like if you're new to riding, just learn the most basic of the technology, which is just the bike itself. Like just ride the bike with nothing. And you're going to learn a lot about the bike by doing that. And you're going to learn a lot about yourself. You're going to get to learn what a hard effort feels like. You're going to get to learn what a easy effort feels like. You're going to get to learn what a 3-hour bike ride feels like. And in the beginning, that's all you need. And that is also exactly that's all we had when bikes were first invented. We had the bike and a stopwatch, and that was it. And then once you get comfortable with that, and that can probably be a quick cycle, right? Like maybe a few months or something, then I would buy like a speedometer, and just, you can find them for like $25 and just get to know, okay, cool. Like, I feel like I'm going fast and, oh, I'm going 20 miles an hour. Like, cool, and that's a good start, you know? And then get yourself a cadence meter. And a lot of those speedometers have cadence. Okay, I think I'm spinning my legs fast. Oh, that's what 80 RPM feels like. I wonder what 120 RPM feels like. Let's see. Oh, cool. Okay. And then you'll get to know that. And then around somewhere after those cadence sensors, we had heart rate monitors, and, we had those well before power meters, and get to know what 120 beats per minute feels like on your bike, and get to know what 180 beats feels like. I don't really care what somebody's max or minimum heart rate is in the beginning. I'm just like, just get familiar with the technology. And in this case, this athlete is learning technology the way it was developed in history. So they're getting a good foundational knowledge that they're building up, right? And then eventually maybe you get a power meter one day, and then you get to know like heart rate and power are like two sides of the same coin, right? Power is showing you, how much work you're actually producing, but heart rate is showing you how your body's responding to that workload. And you could have, me and my twin brother, for example, maybe he's really fit and I'm not. We could be doing the exact same watts. We could each be doing 200 watts, but maybe his heart rate's only 110 and mine's 180 because he's fit and I'm still building fitness. So we're going the same speed, we're built exactly the same, but the effort is dramatically different, and you need to understand both to really get the most out of these tools. So, as far as what cyclometer to buy, it's more of the process I recommend somebody go through to fully understand what information they're gathering. Yeah. So
That's nice, Antonio.
yeah.
So I was just thinking as you were talking that through, that one of the things, so I've been, and you could speak this too, but I've been coaching 25 years, and I feel like I went through this cycle of, I started really simple because I didn't really know what I hopefully, I mean, I'm glad to hear that you thought I knew what I was doing, but I didn't know what I was doing. So didn't know what I was doing. Everything was really simple in terms of all of the data and feedback and all the options that you can get as an athlete to get information. And then through the middle part of all that, I got much more focused on like, oh, I need to know all these numbers. And we got to like have this stuff, and you got to have this technology and that technology. And now I've come back the other way, which is, I don't know if we need all that stuff. I mean, it's helpful, but I think what, like you said, what we really need to focus on first is just feeling our body, like just feel what it feels like. You can get a pretty good idea of how things are going by just listening to it and paying attention. And I feel like a lot of times we rush to the technology because that's, I don't want to say easier, but it's a distraction from what you actually feel. So I really like that concept of just get to know the bike and get to
Oh,
know
yeah.
the pieces of technology kind of in the order they came. That's a really interesting way to think about that. So
Cool.
I like that.
One of the advantages of reading like some of the great coaches in history is that they didn't have much technology. You know, Arthur Lydiard, one of the greatest running coaches of all time, all he had was a stopwatch
Mhm.
and really great running terrain in New Zealand, you know, and you can do a lot with those two. And sometimes when you have less technology, it forces you to focus on the more human things, which is really like when we race, we really just race as hard as we can. We don't really race to a specific number. We hope we can hold a specific number, whether it be power, heart rate, or pace, or whatever. But it's ultimately, it should be just as hard as we can, you know, or as hard as we want to, I guess is probably a better way to put it. And yeah, the coaches of old, they didn't have these other things. Now, with that said, I do love technology, but I try to really like I have to commit to understanding it to if I'm going to use it.
Mhm.
And in the big, I would say another big mistake I see people make is they embrace some new technology and they get frustrated that they don't fully understand it right away, or they just don't know how to interpret the data.
Mhm.
And so what they end up doing is over focusing on a snippet of information, right? Like in power meter training, a big issue with this is FTP,
Mhm.
which is in theory, by definition, is supposed to be like your best 1 hour effort is supposed to estimate your lactate threshold, you know, essentially the best average effort you could hold for an hour. But no one really likes to go as hard as they can for an hour
Oh
unless
gosh,
it's a
yeah.
race. Yeah. So they were like, okay, we'll do a 20-minute effort. And then that'll estimate my FTP. And then I'll use that 20-minute effort to estimate my 1 hour effort that I'm going to use to estimate my Ironman race pace, which is my like 5 or 6 hour effort that's supposed to only be at 75% of my max. And it's like you're taking an estimate of an estimate of an estimate, and it's like completely unrealistic. And people wonder why it's always so confusing,
Yeah.
you know? And I'm like, you know, why don't you just go out and ride 112 miles and see how you feel afterwards? Because you have to feel good enough to run a marathon. So, you
Yeah.
know, and like, and well, oh, and by the way, like go ahead and use a power meter for that 112-mile training ride. Sure. But don't even bother looking at it. Like cover it with a piece of tape and then just like look at what the average power was. And you can learn a lot from just doing that a few times. And as opposed to trying to say, you know, instead of saying I want to hold 200 watts, I'm going to see if I can.
Yeah.
When I opened Tri-Town, I probably could have opened it 4 years before I did, but I was super scared of like all the things I didn't think I knew. And a lot of athletes get stuck in this same paradigm where they think they have to know all these things to take action.
Mhm.
And after I opened the shop with Harold, I realized that like just by taking action, it clarified what I needed to focus on, and that nobody could have really told me exactly what the right steps were until you just start getting into the weeds and figuring it out.
Mhm.
Um, I remember like a friend telling me, somebody who meant very well. They were like, "Well, what's your budget? What's your business plan? Like, what's your, you know, like what's your revenue going to be in the first year?" And I'm like, "Well, there's only like 10 tri stores in the country, and like they don't like open their books to me, and none of them have been in Boise before. I don't know. I don't know." And it's really scary sometimes when you're new to something to have all these I don't knows. And if I could talk to like my 26, 27-year-old self that was, you know, how old I was when I opened Tri-Town, I would just say, hey man, it's okay. Like, don't be stupid, don't try to be smart, just avoid being dumb, and like, I don't know if I know I can't do smart, but maybe I can just barely skip dumb, and if I can do that, I'll be okay. And it's worked out so far,
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's yeah. So I work with a strength coach, and he and I, we have these a lot of conversations, kind of like you and I do too, when I'm working out with him. But one of the things that we talk about a bunch is this idea that at this point in time, it's like, 30 years ago, you could tell somebody what to do and they'd be like, okay, I'm gonna go do it. And now it's like you tell somebody what you think they should do, and you get the barrage of questions like, well, what about this? What about that? And it's like, wait, you haven't even tried it yet. Go try it. And then get your questions, and then we can talk about it. But don't like have this huge amount of, like, you don't need to know everything right now. You're not in a place to even really get why that would be important or not. It's just give it a try first. So I personally, I try to do that too. It's like, don't ask too many questions up front, just go do it and experience it and see how it goes. And then you can start parsing it out.
That's a really cool point, in that we have access to so much information today that we didn't have 20 years ago. The internet was just starting off, right? Now we have almost every answer at our fingertips, but none of those answers are particularly specific to us.
Exactly.
And so what you get is this this paralysis by analysis take place. It didn't happen as often back in the day, because if you found an expert in your community 30 years ago, you're like, this is the expert, whatever they say I do, because I'm not going to find any better information without driving 500 miles, And now we can just sit down and Google what the world champion coach said that in relation to their particular athlete, and then we assume that's better advice, which who knows if it is or isn't.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's good. Yeah. Good stuff.
Cool. We had a cool question come through about the pedal stroke. Can we talk about that? Because that's an area that I love talking about, because I feel like there's a ton of misinformation about this.
So just FYI, Antonio, we have like 9 minutes. So just
9 minutes.
Just keep that in mind. Yeah.
Roger that. This will probably be the last point we make. So the pedal stroke comes up a lot, like when I do bike fits with athletes, and the mistake I see people, or the wrong mental model people come in with, is they're trying to make this perfectly round circle with their legs, especially since we can clip in, right? It's so cool. They're trying to create this even torque environment with the pedals, and they're forgetting the most important thing, and that is that we're an animal that was not meant to apply even torque. That we're an animal that was meant to run, to jump, to skip, to sprint, to walk. And those are all like hip opening movements, which means that we take our knee from a high point and we push it to a low point, right? Like essentially the press up from a squat or a lunge. Like we're really, really good at that. And when we push down on the pedal strokes or on the pedals, we engage about 9 different muscles. And when we pull up, we only engage 2, and they're small little ones. They're the tibialis anterior, kind of the front of your shin, and your hip flexor. And when you push down, you're using your glutes, all your hammies, your quads, your calves, huge fatigue resistant, big muscles to push down. And then there's this follow through that happens at the bottom. It's kind of the scrape back part, right? And there is always a follow through to a powerful movement, right? If you had me swing a bat, I wouldn't just stop at the moment of contact. I would follow through, right? And that's important to do and to think about a little bit. But it's not the emphasis, right? And so you hit that peak force when you're pedaling on the downstroke, and then you follow through, and there's a little bit of a pullback, but it's not the key part. And then on the backstroke, when you're coming up, you just want to lift the weight of the leg. Got to get it out of the way, right? And everyone that's sitting and listening right now, to feel this, all they have to do is like put the weight of their hand on their knee and lift that 90 times in 1 minute with just the weight of their hand, with a slight forward lean, by the way. It's incredibly hard to do. You can't do it, right? Like most people can't, right? And you definitely can't do it for 100 miles, right? And then if I were to say, hey, I'm going to put my hand under your foot and I want you to stomp on it 90 times in a minute, I won't have a hand after a minute, right? Like we can just generate tons of power on the downstroke. There's actually been some really cool studies done on this. And what they found was that the world-class gold medalist cyclist, what they did with their pedal stroke when they analyzed this is that they hit a higher peak force on the downstroke. So let's say that they hit like 50 pounds of force every revolution, right? And that was a higher peak force than like the national caliber cyclist did, which maybe they only hit a peak force of 45 pounds of force on the front, but then on the backstroke, they pulled up with 3. Or maybe they even pulled up with a little bit more than that, but it wasn't enough to make up for the lack of the peak force. And a bike, as we talked about, is a super efficient machine. Once you've hit a peak force a few times in a row, the bike rolls forward as if you're holding that peak force. And so that's kind of in a nutshell how the best cyclists ride. They don't try to be perfectly even. Now, with that said, they're not sloppy, of course, like a new cyclist or one that's bonked out or really trying to figure things out. They'll be pushing back on the backstroke, right? So they don't push down particularly hard on the front, and this leg is lazy, right? So if I hit 20 pounds of force on the front, maybe I subtract 5 on the back, right? We don't want that. We have to get it out of the way, right? Apply a little bit across the top because, you know, every powerful movement has to have a beginning, right? And then you hit that peak force and a little bit of follow through. There are exceptions to this. That is mostly in sprinting. When you sprint, you want to recruit like every muscle to the party. You know, it's why like those Olympic 100-meter people are like so ripped in every way. Their arms are ripped, their shoulders are ripped. Like, why is that needed for sprinting? Because you recruit everything, you know? So when you are sprinting on the bike, you're pulling up, you're doing everything. You're pulling with your arms, you're engaging your back. You know, you're bringing every muscle you can to that effort. It's like the afterburners on a jet. You know, they can't fly for an extended period of time with the afterburners on, only for a few seconds because it's burning through fuel like crazy, but they can use it to accelerate and get away. And it's the same on a bike. So those are kind of my big picture thoughts on the pedal stroke.
Ooh, that's super interesting. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we have time, have you heard of the power cranks before? They're those like independent left-right cranks.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about those actually, since you just talked about that. That was my next question.
I have a set of those, and they've been studied as well pretty extensively. And I rode them once for like a year straight, like just every day, every ride. I never did a race on them, but the reason they don't really work is that you have to make a perfectly even pedal stroke with them, which is great. It really blows your hip flexor. Like the first time somebody rides them, they get like a minute or 2 out of them is all they can do typically. And then I got to a point where I could ride them for like 60, 80 miles. There have been people that have done Ironmans on them before.
Oh.
But what they don't do is they don't teach you how to hit a higher peak force. You actually decrease peak force. So what happens is that you create this more even pedal stroke, but it's not ever hitting a higher peak force, so you don't tend to go faster. And there's been studies that have proven that over and over again. Now, what they did though is I ran the best I've ever ran in my life. And I think it was because, I think it really helped with my knee lift on running because I was having to actively lift my knee, you know, quite aggressively every pedal stroke. And I think for running, you know, as we fatigue, what happens we kind of shorten our stride, you know, maybe because of a lack of a little pushback or a push off, but also because of lack of knee lift. And it really seemed to help running. And you do see in some of the top running, like collegiate programs, that they'll have some trainer bikes set up with power cranks on. And it is a good tool, but it ironically doesn't make you a better cyclist. The mountain bikers are figuring this out. And that's why we're seeing so many of them go back to flats, you know, and they're riding just as fast as before with flat pedals, you know, because it's really about the downstroke. And just don't be sloppy about it.
Yeah, that's the key. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Real quick, just because there was a question that came in, disc brakes versus rim brakes.
Yeah. I mean, disc brakes are 100% the future. They are a new technology for a lot of roadies, you know, and triathletes. They're not as aerodynamic as some of the old integrated rim brakes, but they give you much more braking power across all conditions. They are a little more complicated and they're not intuitive to work on. So there's that hurdle that we have to get over. But for triathletes, oh my gosh, they're so much better than the rim brakes that were integrated on triathlon bikes. I've wasted days of my life trying to adjust an integrated triathlon brake, like on old Trek speed concepts and things like that. Also for carbon fiber wheels, carbon is manufactured with heat and pressure, and a rim brake applies heat and pressure to a carbon fiber rim. That's not what you want to do. That's how you cause it to fail. And so by moving all those crushing and heat pressures to the rotor, or forces to the rotor, you can actually manufacture cheaper carbon rims. And we've seen the price of carbon fiber wheels go down dramatically as they've gone to disc brakes, because the carbon doesn't have to be so exotic and so overbuilt. And they used to have to use very expensive epoxies and carbon layups to accept the braking forces on the carbon rims. Well, at least the good companies did, like Zip, and other companies like Head. They just said, nope, we're never going to do it. We're just going to use an aluminum braking track with a carbon fairing. That's how they got around that problem. But with disc brakes now, you don't have to worry about any of that. So it's 100% the future. It's helped ladies the most, because it requires a lot less smaller hands, a lot less braking force.
That's so much easier. Yes.
Yeah. It's so great. Yeah.
Nice. Very nice. All right, guys. Well, that's our hour. Boy, doesn't time fly when you're having fun. Oh my gosh, so cool. Antonio, thank you so much. If anybody you're welcome to reach out to Antonio. If you have questions that didn't get answered, you can send them to me. I can send them to him, or you can go into Tri-Town and see him. You can email him directly. I'm happy to get people connected if need be. So thanks to everybody for coming. And I look forward to seeing some of you next month. We'll have another great hour of power, but thank you so much, Antonio. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for your time.
All right. Thanks, you guys.
Bye.
I'm gonna stop recording.